Hello again, and welcome to Good Morning Baltimore. I am Rhiannon.
And I'm John.
And we are on our way to work again, so we have more musicals to talk about.
Woohoo!
Yeah! Of course, last time we looked at Groundhog Day and Beetlejuice, two musicals that did not become nearly as popular as their original source material. Today, you're going to hear about two musicals, and you're going to say to yourself, wow, were these based on movies that weren't musicals beforehand? And I will say yes. Those two musicals are Little Shop of Horrors and Hairspray. Today, they are considered some of the greatest musicals of all time. The movies that they're based on weren't nearly as popular, although we did discover that they're really good movies that we enjoyed watching very much. So, Little Shop of Horrors, 1960 film directed by Roger Corman, kind of like a B-movie horror comedy, included a Jack Nicholson cameo.
Yes, as the masochistic dental patient.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was kind of early in his career before he became like really famous for being Jack Nicholson.
And a real curmudgeon.
Yeah. The musical premiered off-Broadway in 1982. It ran off-Broadway for 5 years, won tons of awards, including the Outer Critics Circle Award for Best Musical, the Drama Desk Award for Best Musical, everything but the Tonys, because it didn't get to Broadway until 2004, and at that point it was classified as a revival. But in its off-Broadway run, it was the third longest-running off-Broadway musical of all time. The musical was composed by Alan Menken and Howard Ashman, who you might have heard of for a couple of those movies. Oh, I don't know if you've heard of them. The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin. Hairspray, 1988 movie directed by John Waters. All of it was filmed right here in Baltimore.
Baltimore's own, including Perry Hall High School.
Including Perry Hall High School, which we just drove past and is where I went to high school. The musical opened in 2002. It won 8 Tony Awards, including Best Musical at the 2003 Tonys. And then it went on to run for 2,242 performances. That's 6.5 years. It is the 22nd longest running show of all time. It was composed by Mark Shaman and Scott Whitman, who would go on to compose Catch Me If You Can, is kind of their other big musical, also 2017's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and most recently the movie Mary Poppins Returns. Both musicals also went on to have new movies made of the musicals. And also different from the musicals that we looked at last time, these are musicals that we have seen.
Yes.
I actually did Little Shop of Horrors in high school. I was one of the doo-wop backup singers. And I've seen so many productions of Hairspray. We're in Baltimore. Like, every high school does Hairspray. I never did Hairspray. My high school did Hairspray the year after I graduated. So I've missed the boat on that, but I've seen it. I've seen so many high school productions. I've seen 2 community theater productions. Dad's seen at least a few of those.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, like we discussed last time, musicals like Beetlejuice and Groundhog Day set up a lot of expectation because they're such well-known movies in popular culture that people will have a lot of expectations when they're adapted into something else. You don't have to have those expectations when you're choosing a less popular source material like the 1960 movie of Little Shop of Horrors or 1988's Hairspray.
Yep.
No one is sitting there watching Little Shop, the musical, going, how could they possibly have cut Seymour's mom? Yeah, Seymour had a mom.
Yeah. He was not an orphan.
Yeah. But speaking of characters in shows, also something that we discovered looking at our adaptations before is something they do in musicals is they do a lot of expansion on side characters. I think it's a classic thing in musicals that all characters have to want something. Like the protagonist has their I Want song, and all of the other characters really have to want something. So they really dive into that want in both musicals.
Yes.
In Little Shop, of course, Audrey in the Little Shop movie is just kind of this pretty girl that also works at Mushnik's flower shop and does like start going on dates with Seymour, but like it really is just this cute little romance. But in Little Shop the musical, they kind of build on this idea of Audrey, who is now dating the dentist. The dentist was just kind of a side character in the movie. Audrey now is kind of
abusive relationship.
Yes. And is dreaming about getting out and moving to the suburbs. And then in Hairspray the musical, there is a lot more subplot for Link and for Edna, who's Tracy's mom. Edna is struggling a lot with accepting herself and her size. There's like the line in the musical of like, oh, I haven't been outside since 1950. I don't remember what. And of course by the end she's designed some of her own clothes and she comes out on the Corny Collins show in the clothes she designs.
Yeah.
And Link is an up-and-coming singer who is trying to create a singing career for himself and then has to struggle with whether he wants to kind of give up that singing career to be an activist to end segregation of the Corny Collins show, which might make some enemies and impact his singing career.
Yeah, so some more complexities.
Yeah. But then, of course, while they are expanding some of the side characters, what we did notice is there is a lot of streamlining done to the musicals to kind of hone things in on one specific message and specific idea. Little Shop of Horrors, the movie, the original movie, is very, very different from the musical. So just kind of like walking through the differences, Skid Row kind of creates, it's this whole cast of these kooky characters. There's a lot more that's very madcap about the B-horror comedy that is Little Shop of Horrors. There's this one regular flower shop customer who eats flowers. So he shows up and buys a dozen carnations and then just starts chomping on the buds. And then there's Seymour's mom, who is this hypochondriac and like exclusively eats these health foods that Seymour also eats. At one point, like later in the movie, Audrey gives Seymour a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and he goes, "What does it cure?" And she's like, "Nothing." So you've got Seymour's hypochondriac mom, just this crazy cast of characters, and then of course the plant. And the plant, the first person that Seymour actually feeds to the plant is not the dentist who is dating Audrey and abusing Audrey. It's this random guy who works by the train tracks, and then Seymour witnesses him get hit by a train and goes, "I guess I could feed that to the plant." And then Seymour does kill the dentist, but the dentist is just kind of this other guy that Seymour could kill. He kind of accidentally kills the dentist in a sword fight with dental equipment because he doesn't want the dentist to stick the drill in his mouth.
Pull his teeth.
Yeah. And then Mr. Mushnik in the movie actually gets wise to Seymour is feeding people to the plant much earlier. And the next victim, which is a plot device they use in the musical, but Mushnik actually, it's a robber who comes into the shop and is like, trying to rob the store at gunpoint after closing. So Mushnik tells the robber that the money's in the plant. So Mushnik actually is the next victim.
He's complicit in this.
And then the last victim. Okay, in the Little Shop movie, the plant has hypnosis powers. So he hypnotizes Seymour, and then Seymour kills a prostitute and feeds the prostitute to the plant. Yeah, so it's these much more innocent kind of deaths, I think, than what you get in the musical, because in the musical...
Yeah, there's not motive necessarily except to feed the plant.
musical, well, the big thing in the musical, the plant becomes a lot more articulate in the musical. In the movie, he kind of is just, all he really says is feed me, maybe with a little embellishments on feed me. But of course the plant in the Little Shop musical begins expanding on this and like making all these promises to Seymour about how he's going to make Seymour rich and famous, and then motivated by the idea of riches and fame, he doesn't quite end up killing the dentist, because there does happen to be an accident.
Yes, but yeah, he watches an ethical dilemma, as he puts it. Yes.
And then of course there's this extra motive to kill the dentist because he's in love with Audrey, and the dentist is seriously mistreating Audrey.
Yeah.
But then as the plot goes on, the stakes just keep rising as Mr. Mushnick starts getting suspicious of the idea that this dentist has just died, and Seymour very promptly begins dating Audrey, so he's getting suspicious, and that's when Seymour feeds Mushnick to the plant, and suddenly he's like, it becomes very scary. This is like much worse than he would have imagined. He's just killed his father figure. And then of course it just all tumbles downhill from there.
Yeah. And of course the ending is different.
Yes. In the movie, Seymour does get eaten by the plant, but it's more of a, I just want you to stop eating people, as opposed to you took Audrey from me.
Musical is about the plant's desire for world domination.
Yes. There's just one plant in the original movie. So yeah, it really narrows it down to a much smaller cast of characters and hones it in on the idea of human greed and how people will go to great extents to gain riches, and sometimes it can get real dark.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hairspray, in the meantime, ends up with a much more similar plot, with many of the same major plot strokes. Some of the things that they do cut in the interest of streamlining the plot. There's this one scene with some beatniks because it's the 60s.
Yeah. John Waters just wanted Pia Zadora in the film, and when Pia Zadora couldn't, for scheduling reasons, play like, Velma von Tussle, he was like, well, I've got to get him in, so puts Pia Zadora and Rick Ocasek as this pair of beatniks that when our main protagonists are running away from the cops, run into this beatnik house, and in a very awkward moment. Yeah, it's very funny though.
Yes, it is. It very much. John Waters explores a lot more of the aspects of the 60s.
Yeah, I mean the movie it's a satire, definitely, and he's definitely, satirically skewering all of these things, but in a lot of ways it's a love letter to his childhood and to growing up, and what was known as the Buddy Dean Show, which was like a local kind of American Bandstand kind of show in Baltimore, that the Corny Collins Show is kind of based on. So in a lot of ways it's a love letter to Baltimore, and everything that was good and quirky about it, and everything that was that people were dealing with and wrestling with, and changes that were happening. So you get a lot of that 50s 60s transition, and a transition to a more integrated Baltimore. But John Waters is he's a satirist. This is also kind of his reminiscing about growing up.
Yeah, and then the musical kind of goes and hones in. It takes a much more sincere approach. We talk about John Waters is very satirical, but the musical ends up being a much more sincere approach to that message that love can conquer all forms of prejudice, and that we all need to love and accept everyone, and that everyone deserves the chance to dance together. The musical makes Tracy's size a lot more of an obstacle than what she faces in the movie. In the movie, Amber is really the only one who makes, like, really obnoxious comments about Tracy being big, and everyone else thinks that's obnoxious. Whereas in the musical, there are a lot more people who make fun of Tracy for her size, and Tracy actually auditions once for the Corny Collins show and doesn't get on, and then she auditions again, and then makes her way onto the show. So she faces a lot more obstacle with that, and that kind of builds into the idea that, like, she can empathize with the struggle of all of the black dancers who really want to be on the show, but are not allowed on the show because of the way they look, and she empathizes with that more.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's kind of one of those things that John Waters is more sly with, but that the musical really kind of takes and runs with, this idea of the microaggression towards people who are of greater size, and also it's a class thing, I think. There's
I think class is
that seems to
emphasized
come-
more in the movie.
Yeah. Tracy's family is poor and white, and
Most of the council members are like very well to do, and that comes out a lot more in the movie. And it is what really interested me. There aren't a lot of changes to the plot and kind of the progression of the plot in the movie to the musical, but one of the biggest changes is they move the scenes where Tracy gets put in detention and special ed to before she gets on the show. In the movie, in the John Waters movie, she's already a council member on the Corny Collins show when she gets in trouble at school and gets put in special ed and meets Seaweed and everyone. In the musical, she gets to meet Seaweed beforehand, and it's actually the dance moves that Seaweed teaches her that get her on the show.
Yeah.
And so it intertwines the characters a little bit more. It kind of... Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say, in the process of making Hairspray, the musical, kind of more direct in its message of equality and conquering prejudice, they straight up have a protest, which they don't necessarily do in the John Waters movie. They do kind of have an impromptu sit-in outside the studio where they film. And then there's a scene that they don't really do in the musical outside an amusement park where the Corny Collins show is filming. And it turns into more of a riot than a protest.
Yes.
A couple other fun departures include Tracy actually gets a pardon from the governor in the John Waters movie. She doesn't have to break out of jail. I mean, it's really fun in the musical when Link breaks her out of jail with Hairspray and whatever concoction that involved. But speaking of the 1960s, we were talking about the idea of, like, period pieces and musicals, because Groundhog Day and Beetlejuice were both kind of just put into modern day, even though, of course, the original movies were not set in 2010 something. Of course, Hairspray kind of has to be a period piece.
Right.
And I think it's very interesting. John Waters takes a much more satirical look at the 60s. When you look at everyone's hairstyles in the John Waters movie, they're all exaggeratedly tall.
Yes.
It's
the classic Hun look.
Yes. It's comically huge, and so Hairspray is very much more like excited, fun, welcome to the 60s kind of look at the 60s. We did think it was very interesting that John Waters uses all actual 60s music in his movie, trying to kind of build into the whole homage to the 60s that he's creating. But when they use original music in the musical, I don't think that takes away from using original music instead of actual 60s music. I think they create a wonderful pastiche of the 60s that great bops.
Yeah.
And then Little Shop, yesterday, Dad and I looked at each other and said, you know, Little Shop doesn't need to be in the 60s.
No.
No, you could very well have Little Shop set in the now. Maybe it would be a little harder with security cameras.
Yeah, that's right.
But
yeah.
other than that, kind of, they made it even, the musical ended up deciding to make it even more 60s, I think,
Right.
than the original source material.
Yeah.
Because, of course, you know, I would love to know what conversation they had when they said, you know, what would make this a really great musical? A 60s girl group. Which was such a good idea. I think it was an amazing idea, but I'd love to know where they got that from.
That's right. Yeah, I guess, you know, I guess it's kind of an homage to that, you know, 60s era campy movie sort of thing, and kind of take that to the next level. The tragic story of Seymour.
So yeah, at the end of the day, these are two of the best musicals. Really, I think by most people's standards, two of the best musicals ever made. And they do that by really taking a lot of what's quirky and fun about the source material and putting it on stage, but then also honing in on a message and putting a lot of heart into it. I mean, we'll throw in, they're really good music too, like so many good bops. The way I will probably get a concussion is from headbanging too hard to either You Can't Stop the Beat or Don't Feed the Plants. Like, they're such good songs. Thank you for listening to Good Morning Baltimore. If you have any thoughts on the movies of Little Shop and Hairspray or the musicals that they were made into, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. We'd love to hear them. I'd also like to thank my university for providing me with an iPad and laptop when I started, because I have been using those a lot to make this podcast. Our next episode is going to be a Mel Brooks extravaganza. We're gonna get out the producers and Young Frankenstein. That'll be fun.
Destiny.
I don't
From
remember
Young
that part. Oh, okay. All right. Well, thank you again for listening.
Good morning.